I'm delighted to be here talking about a developmental perspective on synesthesia. Suppose a 4-year-old comes to you with the alphabet, complaining that H's are dirty, not like those brilliant G's. This could be a young Maduri of the kind that Sean just told us a story about. That child may have or be developing synesthesia, which comes from the Greek roots of union of sensation. In this case, the union of color with the characters for the alphabet. It's definitely not a deficit to worry about, as everybody here knows. It will improve the child's memory. Here's a quote from a medical student who had to learn the anatomical names on many, many parts of the brain. Let me say that this is a delightful trait to have. I tend to use it to help me remember names and locations of anatomical structures, especially neuroanatomical structures. You should see the beautiful array of colors in the brain, and neuropathological classifications are easier too. It not only will help that child with memory for names, but also memory for colors. We know this from an early study by Jamie Ward, where participants had to remember colors displayed like this. They studied them for 2 minutes. Then they had to write down the names of all the colors in the order in which they appeared. And then there was another test an hour later. This is a number of colors recalled by the synesthetes, which are black, and the controls who are in gray. Immediately, there's no difference, but after an hour, the synesthetes could still remember, whereas memory had really dropped off in the controls. Synesthesia comes in a lot of other forms besides colored alphabets. So the letters, the musical note, like C sharp, might evoke a particular color, a particular blue, or a particular shape, or a particular taste, like orange is not yet quite ripe. The forms tend to cluster, and we know this from another recent study by Jamie Ward. They form 7 clusters. 4 are quite prominent. They're the first 4 I'm going to tell you about. So in the first cluster, sequences, numbers, letters, days of the week, months of the year, names, words, foreign names, punctuation marks, shapes, evoke colors. Somebody's got a mic on with an echo. So could you mute yourself if you're not talking, please? Thank you. And of course, they're all unique. So 1 might be blue, but 2 will be a different color. Question mark might be blue. An exclamation point will be a different color. This is the most prominent cluster. And what that means is that if a person has, let's say, 3 forms of synesthesia, probably all 3 forms will be one of the ones listed here, or none of them will be listed here because they're in one of the next clusters. The next most common one is to have things appear in space. So numbers might appear on some kind of number line or formation. Months of the year might wrap around the body. Shoe sizes might have an orderly progression into space. Or for the days of the week and the months of the year, it might just be visual forms, or in addition to the spatial sequences. Also common is for other things to evoke colors of shape. So music, emotion, noises, taste, touch, body posture, any of the things listed there can evoke shapes. And the final one that's very common is personification or gendering. So 1 might be female, 2 might be male, 3 might have a nasty personality. That's what's meant by personification or gendering. So this is the most prominent cluster. Any of the things on the left will evoke colors, specific colors for each item. The next most common is to have things appear in space or to elicit visual forms. Also common is for any of the things listed over there on the left to evoke either specific colors or specific shapes. And the final one that's quite common is for numbers, the alphabet, days of the week, or months of the year, to have personalities or genders. Rarer clusters are for any of the items on the left to evoke specific tastes or smell, or in this case, just specific tastes. And finally, the least common cluster is for any of the things on the left there to evoke tactile sensation, the sense of being touched. That said, there were some major leftovers that Jamie and Jules outlined. Hearing motion, so seeing motion and hearing it, ticker tape, hearing speech and perceiving it as being typed out on an old-fashioned ticker tape, or feeling touch when you see someone else touched, or feeling pain when you feel someone else has pain. These are the prevalence figures for synesthesia in adults. I underline in adults. So the classic forms, 4 to 5%, and within that come the colored alphabets at 1 to 1.5%. Add in the spatial forms, you have 8%. Add in those leftovers, maybe another 20 to 25%. What this means is that in every single classroom, there are children who are developing synesthesia. Probably the rates are higher than this in children, as I'll come to in a moment. So every classroom teacher has children who are developing synesthesia in that classroom. It's just as common in the girl students as the boy students, or just as common in males as females when we get to be adults. Now, these many forms of synesthesia, regardless of the form, are automatic. It's not something someone sits around and thinks about doing. The people with synesthesia report they remember having it all their lives, and it's been consistent over time. And in fact, consistency has become the bread and butter test for genuineness, so that the elicited and reported forms are consistent over time. And I should say that 64% of synesthetes have only one type. So they cluster, there are many, many different forms, but a typical synesthesia is only going to have one form of it, but it will be automatic, have been there apparently all that person's life, and will have been consistent over time. Now, clues to where it comes from are the fact that it runs in families. So let's go back to that 4-year-old. In fact, it is a 4-year-old we studied. We had her color 1 letter a day. She had something like an advent calendar. She could open one window. She got a letter, and she had 156 crayon colors, and she chose the appropriate one. Took about a month for her to get through all of the letters. And then the next month she did another cycle, and then still another cycle. And she also did the numbers at the same time. Her mother has synesthesia. These are her mother's colors. You can see that the child's colors are different. So they both have synesthesia, but not the same colors. And often it's not even the same form. The other thing you can see in this child, and you'll hear much more about this from Jules this afternoon, is she's consistent, but not in the way her mother was consistent. Her mother gave us exactly the same colors every single time we asked her. The child, let's look at the B. It's kind of wobbling back and forth between orange and yellow. The F is going to purple. Here's the D wobbling as well. The H is wobbling. So she's not perfectly consistent, but this is very far from random because the variations are tending to occur within color families. So where does this come from? It's useful to understand synesthesia from a developmental perspective. Here's how development plays out in all children. We are born with a brain, a cortex that's hyperconnected, all kinds of possibility, all kinds of possible connections. That hyperconnectivity is refined by input, by learning to match our own environment, and we end up with specialized brains as adults. So we're defined by input. The hyperconnectivity is pruned to match what we're using. What we're not using is pruned away. It's tuned by the environment. Here's one piece of evidence for the hyperconnectivity. These are the number of synapses for each neuron in the visual cortex. Each line is from a different layer of the visual cortex. Here's age, birth is right here. Okay, here's the first year of life. And what you can see, regardless of layer, it keeps going up, up, up. The peak is about a year, and then there's a gradual diminution with age. Transient connections like that are also evident if you look at the brain's use of glucose, what it needs to metabolize. There also, if you look at how things are connected when the brain is just resting, not doing anything in particular, hyperconnectivity, and then pruning away to match the environment. Now, one of the consequences of the hyperconnectivity and the pruning and tuning is that initially, babies can tell apart things that they never see in their environment. For example, a Caucasian 6-month-old baby can tell that these two Caucasian faces are different, and they can also tell that these two Asian faces are different. But come back, and we know that from habituation experiments. So we ask the baby, okay, look at this face, and look at it again, and again, and again, and again. And as we repeat exactly the same face, the baby becomes bored, becomes habituated. If we show it still again, oh my goodness, that's not interesting. But if we switch to a different face, the baby perks up and is interested, telling us that she can tell the difference between the first face and the second face. And with that measure, we know that 6-month-olds can discriminate faces that are Caucasian and faces that are Asian. The same thing is true for Asian 6-month-olds. Come back towards the end of the first year of life and things have changed. The baby continues to discriminate faces like those that are in the baby's own environment. So for this Caucasian baby, those are Caucasian faces, but now fails exactly the same test with Asian faces. After habituation, there is no recovery, no resumption of interest, no apparent ability to discriminate. And you get the reverse pattern among Asian babies. At 9 months, they can still discriminate the Asian faces, but these two Caucasian faces all look the same to them. Same thing happens with monkey faces. You know, babies grow up without seeing very many monkeys. At 6 months, they can discriminate between human faces and between monkey faces equally well. At 9 months, this is the one that's changed. The baby no longer can discriminate between these two. And by the way, at least to me, on first glance, these two look identical, but let me point this out to you that ought to be obvious and would be to a 6-month-old baby, but is not by the time that we've tuned our brains to the human faces we've seen and lost those hyperconnections that allowed us to do the same thing with monkey faces initially. Same story for inverted faces. Initially, the baby can discriminate them readily, but by 9 months, that skill has also gone away because most people don't stand on their heads. Most babies' experience is with upright faces. So here's a diagram of what I've said. We come biologically prepared with hyperconnected brains, allowing us to process whatever we get exposed to. The brain gets tuned to what we are actually exposed to. So for this Caucasian baby, that means tuning into Caucasian faces, tuning out monkey faces, Asian faces, and inverted faces. And the process of doing that is pruning away the unused connections and clamping down and also inhibiting residual ones that are rarely used. So the refinement through pruning and tuning by inhibition. So what's different in synesthesia? One thing that's different is there seems to be less pruning. So there's more short range connectivity and actually hyperconnectivity throughout the brain. This is an early picture from Ed Hubbard and Ramachandran when they first identified the local connectivity. They showed that in people with colored alphabets, there are connections between this color area and the nearby area that processes graphemes. Those are letters of the alphabet. They are hyperconnected with each other, even in adulthood. And they are also hyperconnected with this area up here. It's called the parietal cortex that binds features together. And we now know that this hyperconnectivity is, yes, between its short range, between areas that may be connected in synesthesia, but it actually extends throughout the brain in ways that I'll tell you about in a moment. There's probably also less effective inhibition of any remaining connections that are rarely used. We think this is the case because it's easier to elicit phosphine. So if you stimulate the cortex, you ask, do you see, bright light? You don't have to use as much current in order to do that in adults with synesthesia. And if you release the inhibition by LSD in anyone, you'll get something that's like synesthesia. It's not synesthesia, but it's like synesthesia. So here's what we think is different in people who will be adult synesthetes. There has been less pruning, less inhibition, so they have a less specialized brain. Look at an implication here. Back in this childhood period with all that hyperconnectivity, before there's all that pruning and inhibition, even in the child who won't become an adult synesthete, we would expect synesthesia to be even more prevalent. We would expect it to be even more prevalent in children. Okay, so we can make some predictions from what I just told you, that the brains of adults with synesthesia should be less tuned to exactly what they've seen, what they've been exposed to in the environment, that they should be better at discriminating chimp faces, inverted faces, and other race faces. And we have recently tested that prediction. We took adults with confirmed synesthesia. We asked them to discriminate among these chimp faces. So the task is to look at one chimp face and find the identical one on the bottom. It's not an easy test. That's the right answer in case you're having trouble figuring it out. We also showed them these upside down faces. They're actually 9 distinct faces, but it's kind of hard to tell them apart because unless you're a synesthete, it's kind of hard to tell them apart. So here's what we found. This is the proportion correct among people with synesthesia in Black, non-synesthetes in white. Everybody's pretty good at upright faces. This was a speeded test. We wanted to make it hard, so nobody's up here at ceiling, so everybody can do that. But the chimp and inverted faces, which are harder, chance is 50%. The controls are pretty close to being right at chance, and the synesthetes are better. They can better still tell apart chimp faces and still tell apart inverted faces. Another tuning into the environment we all go through is tuning into the particular language that we're learning. So here I'm going to play two sounds, and your job is to say, are they the same or are they different? Here's one pair.
Da, da.
Okay, just think of your answer, same or different. Here's the second pair.
Da, da.
One case, number one or number two, they were not the same sound. If you don't speak an Asian language, that should be hard. If you don't speak an Asian language, you're not synesthetic, that should be hard because it's a distinction not used in Western languages. It's used in Hindi. The correct answer was the first pair. The two sounds were different. One was da and the other was da. The tongue is in a different place in the mouth and speaking those. So during normal development, if you are an English learning child and you're under 10 months old, you can make that distinction very easily. You can hear
Da, da.
that those two are different. 10 months, the ability is waning, and by adulthood, it's gone completely. So here's another example of how the brain is tuning in, losing hyperconnectivity as it tunes in to the particular sounds that are used, discarding the connections for the ones that are not used. And so when we asked synesthetes and non-synesthetes to do exactly what I just tested you on, listen to two sounds, decide whether they're the same or different. When they are actually the same, it's easy. They all say they are the same. But when they're different, it's really hard. You know, these people, nobody does very well. The synesthetes do significantly better in hearing the trials where they are different. So I've just shown you that on 3 tasks where hyperconnectivity allows young infants to do better than adults, synesthetes as adults continue to do better. Fitting with this model that I showed you at the start. Now, another example of something that we tune out is what's called perfect pitch. So if I sing a song, let's say, happy birthday to you, and I sing it at a different pitch, happy birthday to you. Sorry, it wasn't the same line, it was meant to be. You recognize it as the same tune because you're processing relative pitch. There are adults who have perfect pitch, who could tell you exactly what note I started on each time. Now, we can't do that test with babies, but Jenny Safran figured out a workaround where she played tunes and then changed them, and she discovered that young infants listen to absolute pitch, whereas adults listen to relative pitch. Why do we lose this? You know, it would seem like it'd be nice to all have perfect. Well, we lose it as we learn language, because as the child is learning the meaning of words, mama, 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 that word has the same meaning regardless of the absolute pitch. So the child is trained by the environment to ignore absolute pitch and pay attention to relative pitch. So we predicted if there's been less tuning, there should be more perfect pitch in adults with synesthesia. Less pruning and tuning by inhibition of that perfect pitch that we have in early infancy as languages are learned. And by the way, if you're learning a tonal language where pitch matters, there's much more perfect pitch preserved into adulthood. So if your environment reinforces paying attention to perfect pitch, it sticks. Okay, so we recently completed a study in a science museum in Japan. One of the questions we asked, we verified people as synesthetic or non-synesthetic. One of the questions we asked is, do you have perfect pitch? And many more people with synesthesia reported that they had perfect pitch. Similar result comes from a study by Gregerson. He had a confirmed group of people with perfect pitch. Absolute pitch is a synonym for perfect pitch. And when he asked about classic forms of synesthesia, many of which he verified, instead of getting the normal 4 to 5%, he got 20%. So perfect pitch and synesthesia are much more common together. The final thing I'm going to talk about that's refined by input as we grow up is the coordination of the eyes. If a child's eyes are not straight, the brain gets conflicting signals. And if it's not fixed early, before about age 8, the child will end up with imperfect vision, with amblyopia or lazy eye. There is a critical period in here when you can fix this and prevent amblyopia. And so we predicted that that critical period might not close completely, that the plasticity might not be eliminated completely because of the preserved hyperconnectivity in the brain in adults with synesthesia. So because there's less pruning, less inhibition, the critical period would last longer. And that's exactly what we found in that study in Japan I just mentioned. This is the proportion of adults reporting a vision impairment, much higher in those without synesthesia than in the synesthetic population. So I've shown you 5 examples of retained plasticity in adults with synesthesia, supporting this general model of what's going on. There's a hyperconnected brain, there's some preserved hyperconnectivity, retained plasticity in adults with synesthesia. But this hyperconnectivity, as I mentioned, goes throughout the brain. And it leads, we now know, because of seminal work by Jamie Ward and Joel Semner, to a completely different cognitive profile. And this is important to remember because this different cognitive profile is emerging in that 4-year-old with that colored alphabet and all of those children who have synesthesia, probably at a higher prevalence than in adults. So lots of recent studies show us there are many things synesthetes, adult synesthetes are better at, presumably because of the hyperconnectivity, higher IQ scores, better memory for events, more vivid mental imagery, better sensory thresholds in a lot of domains, color, touch. The color thresholds are better in those with color forms of synesthesia, the touch in those with touch forms of synesthesia. More generally, sensitivity to differences between shapes, and more generally, more sensitive to high spatial frequencies. There are other differences where it's kind of hard to say whether it's better or worse. So there's enhanced attention to detail, hypersensitivity, this all kind of makes sense with the hyperconnected brains. There's a different personality profile. There's less multisensory integration. So people with synesthesia, you would think they might have more multisensory integration because in a way that's what synesthesia is. But when other cases where you need it for normal processing of the environment, for example, lip reading in order to help you to understand what someone is saying, there's less multisensory integration. And there's also an increased risk of autism, of PTSD after trauma, and of anxiety. So this hyperconnectivity that's leading to synesthesia and enhanced plasticity also leads to a completely different cognitive profile. Here's the way to think about it. This is a graphic from Jamie Ward. We all have a degree of synesthetic disposition. So I'm probably back over here. I didn't develop any forms of synesthesia. Nobody in my family ever has. not running in our family at all. So all of us probably genetically inherit a certain degree of synesthetic disposition. The higher the synesthetic disposition, the more likely you are to actually have full-blown synesthesia of one form or another. So if you're over here, it's very likely. If you're down here, it's not as likely. If you're down here where I am, it's likely going to be absent. Also, the higher you are on the synesthetic disposition, the more forms of synesthesia you're likely to have. And the stronger they likely to be, the more likely you are to project onto the world, and the more likely you are to have that different cognitive profile. All of these things have been shown to go together. More forms, stronger forms, more likely to have that different cognitive profile. Now, if I'm a sibling, brother or sister or parent of an adult with synesthesia, my synesthetic disposition is probably over here because we share some genes. Even if I don't have an adult form of synesthesia, I'm going to have a bit of that different cognitive profile, and I'm going to increase the chance that my children will have a synesthetic disposition leading to actual synesthesia. So it runs in families. Just a moment. Okay. So lots of kids have something like synesthesia, and some of them it's on the way to becoming an adult form of synesthesia. A very critical time is between 4 and 8 years of age as children learn the alphabet, number systems, days of the week, months of the year. That's when the synesthesia forms are being tied down. There are influences from the environment, such as the fridge magnets that might have particular colors on them. The first letter of the alphabet tends to be A, so there certainly are environmental influences, and in addition to the genetic differences. The genetic differences have been identified so far on alleles related to brain plasticity and connectivity. That's what's going to be different in the children who are developing synesthesia. So what are the implications of this developmental perspective for synesthesia in the student? Some kids in every class will have or be developing synesthesia. It's in no way a deficit, and it's plastic at this point. It's still changing. There's sibs, they're brothers and sisters, may be different too. The child at this point may not realize that their perception is different from that of every other child. Many children have the unfortunate experience of making a comment to a friend. I don't like the color of your name. Ooh, your name tastes bad. And they get teased after that because their friends don't know what they're talking about. So they're at risk of being teased or even bullied. And they're at risk of perceptual interference. So I can create perceptual interference for you by showing you the Stroop phenomenon. So your job is to read these words as fast as you can, but is to read the color of the ink as fast as you can, ignoring the words. So red, blue, green, orange, purple, it's a cinch, right? Well, now try it. Purple, orange, red, green. You automatically read the word, and that interferes with your being able to process the color. Well, the same thing happens to the young child if you, for example, if 2 induces a red and 5 induces a green, and on the board you put the 2 and the red, you have the matching colors, the child will have an easy time But if you put them in the opposite colors, you're creating a stoop effect for that child, and it's hard for the child to read the numbers. So be careful about causing interference by using colored markers on a whiteboard for the alphabet, for numbers. Be careful about having fixed spatial layouts that may conflict, the alphabet in particular form across the front of the room that may conflict with the child's own spatial visualization of the alphabet. Developing synesthesia can affect the child's number sense, their acquisition of reading, their ability to do arithmetic, and stay tuned for Jules' talk this afternoon, afternoon my time, 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, for details about exactly what that looks like. Personally colored materials can increase efficiency. So there's a great calculator that was developed by Berger, published in Berger et al. 2021, and there's talk at, I think, 3 a.m. my time about it, that some of you in different time zones may hear, but having the calculator, having the right colors on it for synesthete, so they were all personally colored, and they were much more efficient, and most of them loved it. It kind of resonated with them. And obviously promoting individual learning styles fits with what I've told you about the different cognitive profile of adults and children developing synesthesia. So I'd like to thank all the collaborators who helped to collect the data that I told you about from my own lab, and also all the researchers in the field who provided much of the meat for what I just told you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're getting thunderous applause here in the chat. Do you have a few minutes to maybe answer some questions? And you should all have the capacity to raise your hand. If somebody wants to ask a question in the chat, I'll voice it for you, or you can raise your hand, unmute yourself.
This is Yasmin speaking. I would indeed have a question, if I may.
Yes, please.
First of all, many thanks for your lecture. It was highly informative, and again, a pleasure to hear you. One question which I would have is, have you come across synesthetes who only have one type of synesthesia? And all the time I've been busy with synesthesia, which is now about 20 years. I haven't met a single one who has only one type. So I was wondering whether that's only my choice of people, or whether there are indeed people who only have one synesthesia type.
Yes, we have come across people who have only one type of synesthesia. It is true that people who volunteer to be in experiments typically have many types, but even within that population, we have come across it. My 1.64 figure was from a study by Jules Simner, so perhaps she can speak to that. It's a mean. So to get a mean of 1.64, there are people who have many forms of synesthesia, but there are also ones who just have one. I've come across many people who have only colored alphabets. They'll also have colored numbers, so I guess you could count that as 2 forms of synesthesia.
Excellent. Do we have some other questions? I see that there are 42 people here in this presentation. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand or type the question into the chat. And while we're waiting to see if somebody else has a question, I have a question for you, Dr. Maurer. You had mentioned the cognitive profile of the synesthete, and the incidence of PTSD and autism in the synesthete population. Do you have any statistics for the rates of autism in the synesthesia community?
There have been studies that have gone both ways. There have been studies of people with autism showing that synesthesia is more common, and there have been studies of people with synesthesia showing higher scores on autism measures are common, but that's not an answer to your question. So on the AQ and various diagnostic tests, there are higher scores on average from individuals with synesthesia. So if you think most people with synesthesia don't have autism, this is just a co-occurrence of two infrequent events. So if there are genetic changes in brain connectivity and plasticity, they can have far-reaching effects. And so they could put you on a spectrum of a disposition towards autism or on a spectrum towards disposition towards synesthesia, and sometimes you end up on both. And I think we'll learn that there obviously are genetic differences as well in terms of, I don't want to use the word risk. I don't like to say risk of synesthesia. In terms of the probability that you might develop synesthesia and the probability that you might develop autism.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Questions?
I'll raise a question here. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the development of synesthesia in a child, and then the child losing that synesthesia at perhaps around, say, age 16 or 17. Say, if it is just a matter of connectivity, of myelination or such like that, do you have any data on the rate of children who state that they have synesthesia, but then lose it in their later teenage years?
No, I don't. But from what I know about development, I can speculate because the brain is reorganizing in adolescence as well. Connections to the frontal cortex are being consolidated, and so there's a period where the connectivity is changing again, and I could imagine that has something to do with it. There can be some key points when things can change, and that would be another one as the brain reorganizes. You know, as the brain reorganizes during the first few years of life, and again in adolescence.
We're starting to see some questions coming into the chat. So Aurora says the failed pruning hypothesis fits well with types of synesthesia where the inducer and concurrent relate to brain areas that are dedicated to one function, grapheme, VWFA, color, V4. But what about types where there is no specific brain area for this function? For example, graphemes or personality.
Yep, that's why I said it goes way beyond local connectivity. Initially, when Ed Hubbard and Ramachandran proposed the hyperkinetic connectivity hypothesis, we were just talking about adjacent brain areas. We now know from anatomical and imaging studies that the hyperconnectivity is much more widespread. Also, now that personification has been accepted as a form of synesthesia, obviously something more than that has to be going on. I think that fits well with a different cognitive profile that Jamie Ward has identified. Why would IQ be enhanced? Because there's a connection between the color area and the alphabet area, right? It has to be with hyperconnectivity throughout the brain, probably involving the frontal cortex. as well as many other areas.
And another question from Yasmin, and a thank you from Mirar. Yasmin says, Dr. Maurer, what would your opinion concerning a probability of developing synesthesia as well as giftedness or sensory processing sensitivity?
Highly probable, because the hyperconnectivity can lead to either one of those. So if a child has a brain, you need a brain that is pretty well tuned to the environment in which you have to function. If you don't have that, you're in trouble. But if you have more than that, it can get you into trouble by giving you a sensory processing sensitivity, having too much sensitivity to bright lights, to loud sounds. But it also gives you a potential to work with the extra connectivity, to become creative, or to develop a talent, some kind of savant ability, some kind of giftedness.
Excellent. Does anyone else have a question to ask in our last couple of minutes? We're really pretty much ready to wrap up. And many thanks from Yasmin for that answer. I'm just going to stay here for a moment in the chats. If anybody else has a question, just quickly out of curiosity, if there is time, do all the synesthetes with absolute pitch have pitch color synesthesia or pitch whatever synesthesia?
The answer is not necessarily. And if they did, I would say this was not a very interesting result, because if I have pitch color synesthesia, I have an extra cue. It's an extra memory aid. So I know that that pitch is red. So if I hear red, I can tell you what the pitch is. But people with synesthesia, but not a form involving an extra cue attached to pitch, also are more likely to have perfect pitch. Excellent question. Because I think that we're just, because of the extra memory aid from pitch to something, it wouldn't be so interesting.
Excellent.
And I want to thank all the researchers in the field. I mean, you did the bulk of the work. I just put together, a story based on what you've published mostly in the last 5 years.
It's so lovely to see so many of those researchers with us today. And I'm just so grateful for your time this morning and the fact that you joined us and gave such a fantastic presentation, so thought-provoking. If you will email me the PDF, Jamie Ward to everyone. Thanks, Daphne. It was a great summary. And Jamie, we're delighted to have you here.
Okay, thank you all. I think we go back to Excel events now.
Excellent. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you back in Excel events. We've got about a 20-minute break, and then we'll be going to Anton Dorso's presentation, and we'll see you there on Excel events. Bye, everybody.
Bye.